So tonight we're gonna show our a video. This video is actually 2 hours long, so I've actually skipped through a little bit of the front introductory stuff, which is actually good, but to kind of give you the meat of the stuff that shows the land of Goshen and the excavations and all that, because that's really what I'm trying to point out to you, is the stuff we learned in Genesis. And so what this whole video, though, the length of it is all about is, it's called Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus. And so it's building the case with scientific evidences, and he does a tremendous job. I wish we had time to watch it all, showing how there is solid evidence in history, archaeology, even in writings, ancient writings, that the Exodus truly happened and when it happened, because there are so many scientists and archaeologists since 1950 that have been claiming that it did not happen because it's not found anywhere in archaeology at the time that Ramses II ruled, right? But what he goes through and points out is how the evidence is there. The patterns of evidence of this great event happening is in archaeology and it's in history, but it's earlier in Egyptian history. And so that's what this is all about. What we're going to just watch is about 45 minutes to about an hour maybe, just to give you an idea of the stuff that's going on over there, the digs and some of the evidences. When we finish our video, I'm going to try to stop it at 5 till or right at the 6:30 mark, 7:30 mark. And so when we stop it, I'm going to talk to you about what we'll be studying next week, how we're going to lay all that out. But that will give more of our class time to be here for that discussion. So, having said that, let's pray and then we'll get this going, and I'll flip the lights off so you can maybe have less glare. All right. Father, thank you for tonight. We pray that you would help us to learn from the video we're about to watch, and we pray, Lord, that you'd bless those who watch from home. I know it may not be as good as being here, but we pray that you'd bless them as they watch and take part in our class with us. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Play so we can get it going. Thank you, Rick.
Judaism and Christianity are both based on a gigantic lie. It was the type of question that troubled a filmmaker from Minneapolis named Timothy Mahoney. As he probed more deeply, little did Mahoney realize how far his journey would take him.
The more I looked into the Exodus, the more I realized its significance. I knew I had to investigate this story for myself. And the first step was to explore whether there was any hard evidence for the Exodus at all. I began my journey by traveling to the very place the Bible says it happened, the ancient land of Egypt. I was raised as a Christian, and I remember hearing amazing stories from the Bible as a child, and I believed them. Stories about an ancient family of shepherds, the sons of Jacob, who came from a foreign land to Egypt. They were enslaved by the Pharaoh, then miraculously delivered out of Egypt, and journeyed across the desert to conquer the promised land. But as I grew older, I was challenged to lose those beliefs. Now, I just wanted to know the truth.
The Exodus is believed by most scholars to have occurred in the reign of Ramses II. Ramses was Egypt's greatest builder king. Were these mighty monuments built on the sweat and toil of Hebrew slaves?
If experts say there's no evidence during the time of Ramesses, why do they think he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus? I'm no historian, so I had to find a way to visualize how the history of ancient Egypt related to the events of the Bible. The thought came to me to imagine a wall of time extending back to the earliest moments of civilization. On the first level, Egyptian history, and above it, the events recorded in the Bible. And at the bottom, a timeline of absolute dates and a movable base to gauge the events of history, with great pylons marking every 1,000 years.
Over the course of 2,000 years, Egypt experienced three great periods of power. It began with the Old Kingdom, with its great pyramids of stone. Then came the Middle Kingdom, the high point of art and literature. Finally, the New Kingdom, with its vast empires that dominated foreign lands. These great periods of power were followed by dark periods of disunity and weakness. Ramesses II was a pharaoh of the New Kingdom who ruled a grand empire and filled Egypt with his monuments. There's one crucial passage in the Bible that leads many to chain the Exodus event to the time of Pharaoh Ramesses, and what is known as the Ramesses Exodus theory.
Key to that theory is the building of the city of Ramesses, mentioned in Exodus 1:11. The Hebrews are making bricks to build the city of Ramesses, or the storage facilities of Ramesses.
Professor James Hoffmeyer is one of the few Egyptologists who has written extensively on the biblical Exodus.
This important city, which we know Ramesses II built, it's being excavated even as we speak and continues to be studied. This city has a very brief history. By around 1100 BC, the city's gone. It has a very narrow history of no more than 200 years. So the question is, if this building project that the Israelites are involved in is Ramesses II's Delta residence, then we have no escape but to say this is an important chronological marker, and that can only be somewhere in the 13th century BC.
Dates in the BC period can be confusing to work with because they move in the opposite direction to modern AD dates. The farther back you go in time, the bigger the BC number. So the Ramesses Exodus theory places the Exodus about 250 years before 1000 BC, or at about 1250 BC. I wanted an Egyptian perspective, so I went to see Mansour Barayak, Director General of Antiquities for Luxor, one of Egypt's most important archaeological sites. I asked Mansour if he was in agreement that there was no evidence for the early Israelites or the Exodus in Egypt.
Nobody knows what the sand of Egypt can tell of secrets. Maybe in the excavation will find some evidence. But so far, there is no documented evidence about the Exodus. But we know the Exodus from the Holy Books. It's mentioned in Quran, in the Holy Quran. It's in the Holy Bible. But in the ground, we have no evidence.
Well, it wasn't as if I hadn't heard this before, but I was still hopeful of finding something in the ruins of this magnificent civilization. What I really needed, though, was physical evidence of the cultural group that the Israelites were a part of, Semites, coming down to live in Egypt from a land called Canaan.
The problem is that no archaeological evidence has turned up for these Semites in the city built by Ramesses II.
But then I heard of something that seemed astonishing. New archaeological discoveries of a city and a people that appeared to match the biblical story, made at the very location of the city of Ramesses, where the Bible places the Israelites.
Mahoney would be interviewing one of the world's most respected Egyptologists. Professor Manfred Bitak and his Austrian team have been digging in Egypt's delta for over 30 years at the site of Avaris. Avaris lies directly below the southern sector of the city of Ramesses.
I asked Manfred to tell me about these exciting new finds.
So we uncovered the remains of a huge town of 250 hectares with a population of approximately 25,000 to 30,000 individuals. These were people who originated from Canaan, Syria, Palestine. Originally, they may have come here as subjects of the Egyptian crown or with the blessing of the Egyptian crown. Obviously, this town enjoyed something like a special status, like a free zone, something like that.
This sounded exactly like the Bible. Pharaoh gave his blessing by allowing the early Israelites to freely settle in the best part of Egypt. Once there, they and their flocks prospered and multiplied greatly. This was just what I was looking for. So
you see, that's the main reason I want you all to see. They're doing those digs right there in the land of Goshen. They're finding evidence of Syrian, Canaan, Palestinian people that have lived there by the tens of thousands. They were sheep herders. Everything's matching up. And this is archaeological evidence. So,
could these foreigners be the early Israelites?
We have some evidence of shepherders. We find again and again in this area pits with goats and sheep. So we know shepherders, probably Bedouins with huge herds roamed around this. But to connect this with the proto-Israelites is a very vague affair.
I was stunned when Manfred said it was a weak affair. Why couldn't these be the Israelites when they matched the Bible story so well?
According to my opinion, the settlement of the proto-Israelites in Canaan only happened from the 12th century BC onwards.
What Manfred was telling me is that the physical evidence of these people is centuries too early to be connected to the events of the Exodus. This is profound, because no Israelites in Egypt means no Exodus, and no Exodus means that the foundation of Judaism is a myth. And for Christians, it means Jesus Christ and the writers of the New Testament got it wrong, because they all accepted the reality of Moses and the Exodus and built their teachings on them. I returned home from Egypt. I wanted to be open-minded, but as I replayed the interview in my thoughts, a cold chill came over me. All my life I had believed the Bible stories to be true. I know some people say, you don't need any evidence, just have faith. But if there's no hard evidence for any of it, had I been believing in a lie all this time? And what about my kids and grandkids? What should they put their faith in? Whether you believe these stories or not, isn't it important to know what's really true? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't stop now, no matter how hard it would be. I made a decision. I had to go back to Egypt.
Mahoney arranged to meet with one of America's leading Egyptologists, Professor Kent Weeks. He rediscovered KV5, the tomb of the sons of Ramses II in the Valley of the Kings. He brought up a crucial issue when considering the problems with these events.
Ramses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. How can we prove that? Chronology doesn't really help. The chronology of Egypt is still a bit ambiguous. Correlations between Egyptian chronology and that of other cultures in the ancient Near East is even more confusing. We don't know precisely when the Exodus happened. Some people say it was Ramses II. It makes nice theater because he was a great, powerful ruler. Everybody knows his name. He built fantastic monuments. Everything really is appealing to have him be the one to choose.
Because he'd be a very large opponent, wouldn't he?
He would be indeed. So yeah, I think Ramses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, but other Egyptologists disagree. Almost any pharaoh could be the pharaoh of the Exodus if we can prove there even was an Exodus.
But if Ramesses wasn't the pharaoh of the Exodus, then who was? Looking for the Exodus in a different time or reign could be the solution. Maybe Ramesses is the problem. I found Mansour's openness refreshing.
Scientifically, you have to open your mind to all the opinion, read it by yourself. Don't let anybody affect in what you believe. But also, on the other hand, you have to accept the other opinion. Your opinion are not always the right opinion. You have to accept the other opinion. The debate with me, discuss. You can convince me, or shall I convince you? Leave it to the public to judge. We have a myth, we have a story. This is the holy books. Who knows? And then you will come with a conclusion. And this conclusion will be in front of the public. The public can judge.
It was clear I needed a new approach. What might even be considered a scientific approach, beginning by taking a closer look at the details of the biblical story.
The oldest accounts of the Exodus were written down in Hebrew in the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah.
I asked Rabbi Manis Friedman, a member of Judaism's Orthodox branch, to recount the ancient stories of the Bible from these sacred scrolls. In order to test the Exodus fairly, I wanted to know what the story was actually claiming.
The story of the Exodus begins before the Israelites leave Egypt. It begins with Abraham, when God brings him to the land of Canaan and makes a covenant with him. And in that covenant spells out the entire Exodus. The Lord said to Abraham, "All this land you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Go, walk through the length and breadth of this land, for I am giving it to you." On that day, the Lord made a covenant, a formal promise to Abraham. He said, "To your descendants I give this land." God led Abraham outside, and he said, "Look up to heaven and count the stars, if you can. So numerous will your offspring be." And God said, "Your descendants will be foreigners in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and oppressed. But I will judge the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions and return here."
According to the text, the events of the Exodus were not a historical accident. They were directed by the God of Abraham every step of the way.
As my team and I looked more closely at this account, we could see that these biblical events formed a sequence that could guide the entire investigation. I imagined the 6 steps of the biblical sequence, the major events of the Exodus story running parallel to Egyptian history, starting with the arrival of Abraham's descendants in Egypt, their tremendous multiplication, their descent into slavery, the judgment of the nation that enslaved them, their deliverance and exodus out of Egypt, and finally in Canaan, their conquest of the promised land. If the Exodus really happened, there are elements in the story that are so big that you'd think some remnants of evidence would have been left behind, somewhere in Egypt's history. We knew science solved problems by looking for patterns of evidence, and a truly scientific approach looks for those patterns no matter where they exist. I set out to see whether a pattern matching this sequence could be found, starting with the first step, the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt.
The book of Genesis tells us that the first descendant of Abraham to arrive in Egypt was his great-grandson, Joseph, the son of Jacob. Joseph's brothers had sold him as a slave to a caravan of traders who brought him down to Egypt.
Then, in an amazing turn of events, he rises to become the highest official in Egypt. He saves the country from a terrible famine, enables his father Jacob and his entire family to settle in the best part of the land, a place called Goshen.
My objective was to see if any specific evidence had been uncovered of the Semitic family group arriving in Egypt, as told in the Bible. So far, I had none.
So far, not. We only know we have some evidence of shepherds in Israel. So far, not.
I was stuck, but that was soon to change, when suddenly something was telling me to go to my library and search out a book given to me a year earlier that I had never read. What startled me was that this author had answers to the very doubts that Vitek had raised in me. He had spent his whole life exploring the Middle East, a man familiar with the mysterious inscriptions and hieroglyphs of the pharaohs, and what they might reveal about the biblical stories.
David Rowe, author, historian, and Egyptologist, is an agnostic, someone who remains unconvinced of the existence of God. Yet, he clearly sees archaeological evidence of the biblical Joseph, Jacob, and the early Hebrews in the Nile Delta region of Egypt. Rowe believes that many Egyptologists have missed evidence for the Exodus because they have been looking for it in the wrong time period. While most scholars think that the events of the Exodus happened in the New Kingdom, David Rowe's view would put the Exodus in an entirely different period, the earlier Middle Kingdom, where he claims evidence for the Exodus can be seen.
I wanted him to explain why he had come to such a different conclusion than Manfred Vitek about Joseph and the early Israelites. Tell me, who is Manfred Vitek?
Manfred Vitek is probably one of the greatest archaeologists alive today, and he's dug at one of the most important sites in the Eastern Delta, a city called Avaris, which is in the land of Goshen, which the Bible calls it, and I believe this is the place where Joseph and his brethren lived.
Well, I want to see Manfred Vitek.
Right.
And that's not what he said. He said there's no evidence of this at the time of Ramesses.
Exactly right. Most scholars will say if you look at the city of Ramesses, there are no Asiatics there. There are no Western Asiatics living in that particular city. But dig down a little bit deeper, and you do find a city full of Asiatics.
Yeah, but the Bible says it happened at the time of Ramesses. What are you saying?
I'm saying that this particular mention of the city of Ramses, the building of Ramses, is what we call an anachronism. It's something that's been added into the text later by an editor. So what the editor is basically saying is, this is the place where the Israelites built the store city, and we know it today as Ramesses. Well, in the ancient times it was called Avaris.
Okay, so the people would know the area, the region.
The people of the Bible would have known where Ramesses was, and where therefore their ancestors actually built the city.
I also found that the Bible, in the book of Genesis, uses the word Ramesses hundreds of years before Pharaoh Ramesses or his city existed to describe the land where Joseph's family settled. So if the name Ramesses in Genesis does not refer to the time of Pharaoh Ramesses II, then why should the mention of Ramesses in the book of Exodus be any different?
Now this Avaris is the city which lies under the biblical Ramesses. Ramesses of the New Kingdom, Avaris of the Middle Kingdom, the 13th dynasty. It lies underneath the city that's mentioned in the Bible. So when Vitek digs up a huge population of Semitic-speaking peoples with Semitic culture, living in the city of Avaris for several hundred years, and then, at the end of the period, these Semites all leave, depart with their belongings and abandon the city, whatever Manfred says, that to me sounds awfully like the Israelites.
Well, what he told me was that there was no connection.
Well, look at the evidence that you've got here. Right at the beginning, at the heart of this community, at the end of the 12th dynasty, we see a Syrian house appear. The Austrians call them Mittelsaal houses. This type of house is found in North Syria, the area where Abraham came from. It's exactly the same style of house you'd expect Jacob to build for himself in Egypt. And we know that the Israelites sought their brides from Haran in that region. They all went back to get their brides from there. So the culture that turns up in Egypt at the end of the 12th dynasty seems to have come from North Syria originally.
So what is the connection with Joseph out of Ars?
Well, after this house of Jacob, if we can call it that, is built, eventually it's flattened, and on top of it, an Egyptian palace is constructed, Egyptian architecture this time. However, the occupant was not Egyptian.
The palace had courtyards, colonnades, audience chambers. There was even a robing room.
It obviously belonged to some high official of state, who was very, very important to that state. Because when somebody gets a palace like this given to them, it means they're being honoured for what they've done for the state.
Now in the garden behind the palace, the archaeologists found 12 main graves, with memorial chapels on top of them.
You have 12
We have
graves.
12 graves.
Well, why would that be significant?
Well, think about it. How many sons did Jacob have?
Yeah.
How many tribes were there?
12 tribes.
Exactly. And what's also amazing is the palace had a facade, a portico with 12 pillars. So you've got 12 sons, 12 tribes, 12 pillars, and 12 tombs.
Interesting.
Yeah, is that all coincidence?
All
Now
archaeological.
one of these 12 graves was very special, because it was a pyramid tomb. This in itself is extraordinary, because only pharaohs and queens had pyramid tombs at this time. Yet the person buried in this tomb was not a king. Even so, he was honoured with a king's burial. And inside the chapel of the tomb was a statue. What we know from the statue is that this man had red hair. He had pale yellow skin, which is how Egyptians depict northerners. He had a throw stick across his shoulder, a unique symbol of office made for this Asiatic official living in the land of Goshen. And on the back of his shoulder, we see the faintest remains of paint, coloured stripes from a multicoloured coat.
And that matches exactly with the story of Joseph in the Bible. The multicolored coat as a gift, which shows that he was the favorite of the father. And it almost becomes his insignia, this coat. It's the thing we remember about him most of all.
Do you know of any other statues of a Semite of this kind in Egypt?
There is nothing else like this in the whole of Egyptian history. Nothing at all.
David Rowe is not the only one to see a connection with Joseph at Avaris. Mahoney went to see Professor Charles Ailing, an Egyptologist who has also investigated the events of the Exodus and its connection to Egypt.
Would it be unusual for a tomb to have a statue?
No, it's unusual to have one this large. This would be probably twice the size of a normal human being.
What does that tell you when the statue's larger?
That it's a very important person. Now, of course, this is not a pharaoh's tomb or palace, but the man who lived there, you can identify his nationality by looking at the fragments of the statue. Three things. The hairstyle he has, which we often call the mushroom hairstyle. And then secondly, the weapon he carries over his shoulder called a throw stick, which we would associate with like an Australian boomerang. And then the coloration of the skin. The skin is yellow. All those things indicate that this would have been a Syro-Palestinian.
Dr. Ailing, do you think this is Joseph?
Either it is Joseph or it's somebody that has a career remarkably the same as Joseph did. It's just an incredible thing to find this at this time period.
The Exodus is a story about the birth of a nation. It was time for Mahoney to go to Israel. This gave him the unique opportunity to meet with Israel's President Shimon Peres and hear his perspective about the character of Joseph and his rise from slavery to governing Pharaoh's court.
If you look at the way the story is written, God chose him for a mission.
I read somewhere that Tolstoy said that this is the greatest story ever published in human literature. The story of Joseph and his brother and his going to Egypt. Joseph was the first Jewish advisor on earth. And he advised the most powerful empire in the vicinity. He conquered the heart of everybody he saw, men and women.
With God's help, Joseph was able to save Egypt by warning of a coming calamity. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of terrible famine. Pharaoh is so impressed that he puts Joseph in charge of preparing for the famine and makes him second in command over the entire country.
He managed to achieve this by foretelling or explaining the dreams of Pharaoh about cattle coming out of the water of the Nile. As first of all 7 fat cows, and then 7 lean cows come out and devour the fat cows. It's an extraordinary story, but the clue here is that these cows are coming out of the Nile. It's the Nile itself which is the cause of both the plenty and the famine.
If David's interpretation is right, then the regulation of the Nile may have been key in planning for the coming famine.
There's a canal or a waterway that connects the Nile to the Fayoum Basin, which is a large lake area, which has the name Bahr Yosef, which means the waterway of Joseph. And this goes back thousands of years as far as we can tell.
Why do you think that that canal has that in it?
Because I think he made it. I think it was under his instructions as Vizier of Egypt that that canal was cut. And it was cut to divert half the water from the Nile into the Fayoum Basin. You then get back to the situation where the water levels are just right for growing crops.
Can you see it today?
It's still in use today.
And the construction of this water diversion system is dated to the same period as the early settlement at Avaris.
Amazing.
Joseph gathers up all the grain during the 7 years of plenty in Egypt. He gathered as much as the sand of the sea. And then the famine comes to the entire region. And only Egypt has bread. So everyone comes to Joseph for what they need for survival. When their money runs out, they sold their animals. When that ran out, they sold their land, and eventually they sold themselves. So Pharaoh, by the end of the 7 years, owns everything in Egypt.
Mahoney wanted to know if there ever was a time in this era when a dramatic shift of wealth and power occurred between the people of Egypt and the Pharaoh. He went to Pennsylvania to see an archaeologist who spent many years studying the Exodus and the conquest. His name is Dr. Bryant Wood.
When we look at Egyptian history, we find something very significant happened at this exact time. Egypt was divided up into areas called nomes, kind of like districts all over the country. And the leaders of these nomes had tremendous wealth and tremendous power. We get to a point in Egyptian history when suddenly that all changes and all the wealth is concentrated with the Pharaoh. What on earth happened here? If you read the Egyptian history books, there is no explanation for it. They don't know what happened, how it happened. I mean, this was a tremendous social, economic change.
Well, what do you think happened?
Well, we have the answer in the Bible, and it's Joseph's famine policy, and he brings the wealth into Pharaoh, and it fits exactly with Egyptian history.
David believes these events occurred during the reigns of 2 important Middle Kingdom pharaohs.
This key time is during the co-regency between Senusret III and his son Amenemhat III. I believe this is the time of the famine, and that Amenemhat was Joseph's pharaoh. Amenemhat is depicted with worry lines. His ears are turned out so that he can listen to the concerns of the people. He's not depicted in the usual bland way that you see in all the other statues of past and future pharaohs. And I think this is an indication that in his time, Egypt was experiencing serious problems. And guess what? He builds his pyramid right next to Bahr Yosef, the waterway of Joseph.
The amount of archaeological evidence matching the first step of arrival in the biblical sequence seemed overwhelming to Mahoney. The Syrian-styled house that appeared in the Delta along with the palace fit for royalty, whose occupant was a high Semitic official from the Canaan area who wore a multicolored coat. The waterway of Joseph, contemporary with the rise of Avaris. The end of influence and wealth for the regional governors as the power of Pharaoh reached new heights. Yet these events converged at a time when the statues of the pharaohs were depicted in a unique, careworn way, the telltale signs of a kingdom in distress.
Well, why is it that we've never heard of these finds?
Because in the scheme that's used by scholars to date all these events, they're way too early. They're much too early to be Israelites. I'm basically saying, well, why not call a spade a spade?
At the pyramid tomb of Avaris, excavations revealed one other important piece of evidence.
The crucial clue for me, which says to me that this man with the multicolored coat is Joseph, is found in the story of Exodus. When Joseph is on his deathbed, he tells his brethren that when they leave, they must take his body with them to the promised land. What matches the story even more incredibly is that pyramid tomb was empty when the archaeologists found it. There was nothing in it at all apart from a few fragments of this smashed statue. There were no bones, there were no mummy beads, no coffin wood, nothing. It was cleaned out.
So it was a grave robber?
Not a grave robber. What grave robber is going to take the bones? Bones are intrinsically of no value whatsoever, and nobody takes the bones. Only people who are treating the body with reverence take the bones. The body was taken out, and all the grave goods were taken out. I think this is the tomb of Joseph, the pyramid tomb of Joseph, honored by Pharaoh with a colossal statue, that when Moses decided to take the people out of Egypt, he made sure he fulfilled that promise of Joseph to take the body out of the tomb and take it to Shechem and bury him in the promised land.
This location, photographed in the 1800s, is where many believe Joseph's bones were finally laid to rest in the ancient town of Shechem in Canaan. The city is known today as Nablus on the West Bank, where this tomb has been at the center of much political and religious tension.
The Exodus is surrounded by controversy on many levels. Even David Rohl, suggesting specific evidence of Joseph and the early Israelites' arrival in Egypt, is archaeologically controversial because he looks earlier in time than what is conventionally accepted. But at this stage, I didn't care. I was determined to stick with the guidelines of the investigation, looking for a pattern of evidence wherever it might exist.
Then David Rohl began to tell about the remarkable expansion that happened at Avaris, which fits the next step of the sequence, what the Bible describes as exceedingly great multiplication.
So Joseph dies, and his brothers, and the entire generation. The Israelites are multiplying, and they're fruitful exceedingly until they fill the land.
We see a virgin land with no population at all, and suddenly a small group of Semitic people settle there. A dozen houses or so, about 70 or 100 people all told. And over a period of maybe 3 or 4 generations, it becomes a very large city, and it's one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The city is a city of foreigners in the Egyptian Delta, and it's been allowed by the Egyptian state. At this stage, there are no slaves involved here. We're talking about Semitic peoples coming in, living here, bringing their flocks with them, and surviving in such a way that they become quite rich and wealthy.
We do know that there was a large Semitic-speaking population, probably came in from Syria, Canaan, sometime in the early part of the 2nd millennium BC. Their remains have been found at a number of sites. We have tombs that are clearly those of foreigners, Semites. We can tell this by the pottery, by the kind of weapons. These are not Egyptian-type daggers. They have donkeys in some cases buried with them. This was not an Egyptian practice. We can't say for sure that any of these were Hebrews, but we probably couldn't distinguish a Hebrew from a Canaanite in Egypt, culturally speaking anyway.
Most of the people being interviewed are not Christians. That's what makes this so powerful, is they don't see it, but the evidence they're giving you is solid scientific evidence, and they don't have an agenda to try to sell you anything. And the guy who's asking the questions, he's just seeing what the evidence is saying. That's what makes this so good. It's not just a stacked deck. It's,
Is he a Christian then?
yes, the guy who's doing the narrating is Christian.
Bristol to meet with a scholar who had information about the expansion of these people in the Delta. John Benson is a professor of Old Testament at Trinity College, Bristol. He specializes in biblical history and its related archaeology. Benson sees a clear connection between the growth of Semitic sites in the Delta and the biblical account.
How many sites would there have been?
We've got a good many settlements, 20 or more, which would fit the land of Goshen, where the Bible says the Israelites were settled. And many of these have not been fully excavated yet.
That are similar to the Avar site?
We don't know whether they're as big until people start digging there. The Avar site, of course, no one knew how big that was until excavation began. So there could be a lot of stuff in the ground waiting to be discovered and to throw a lot more light on this period of Asiatic settlement.
The only time that the archaeology shows massive numbers of Semites living in ancient Egypt is in this earlier period around the Middle Kingdom. This is strikingly different from the New Kingdom and the time of Ramses, when there is no evidence of this.
The question is, does the Middle Kingdom also contain evidence for the next step of the biblical sequence? Slavery.
Cecil B. DeMille portrayed this slavery in two of his famous films, both called The Ten Commandments. Although Hollywood likes to focus on the Israelites moving large blocks of stone, the Bible never mentions this.
A new Pharaoh arises, and he doesn't remember Joseph. He enslaves the people because they're becoming too numerous and becoming a threat. So he puts them to work and embitters their lives, building store cities of Piton and Ramses, and makes them create bricks out of mud and straw.
It was intriguing to see this type of construction in different parts of Egypt. Were any of these bricks molded by the hands of Israelite slaves? However, Mansour was quick to remind me that these types of mud bricks are present throughout Egypt's history and don't prove any connection to the Israelites. But is there any slavery evidence matching the Bible out of Ars, the older city beneath Ramesses? David, what does the archaeological record reveal at this location?
We've got a situation of prosperity followed by a lack of prosperity and a shortage of life. We begin to see in the graves of these people Harris lines in the bones, which indicate shortage of food and nutrients. These people suddenly become impoverished, and they're dying at an age of typically between 32 and 34 years. So how do we explain that? What is the mechanism that we would understand why these people only lived to such a short age? And the obvious answer is slavery.
The description of slavery was so horrible, downhearted. You take a whole people and make from them inhumane group of men working so hard. They wanted to free themselves.
The Bible then tells us that the more the Hebrews were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread throughout the land of Egypt. Pharaoh gives the order for all the baby boys who are born to be thrown into the river by the Egyptians. It was during this time Moses is born, and in fear for his life, his mother hides him in a basket and floats it among the reeds of the river Nile. But God is watching over baby Moses. And Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe in the Nile. She finds him, adopts him, and names him Moses, which means drawn from the water.
Is there anything in Egyptian archaeology that might reflect this biblical detail, the killing of Hebrew infant boys?
At this particular point, we start to see an increase in the number of infant burials at the site. Now, normally in a typical Middle Bronze Age cemetery, we'll get something like 25% of burials of infants. In this particular case, the figure jumps up to an extraordinary figure.
David directed me to the dig reports from Avaris, where BTEC's team referred to what they called an extremely high mortality rate of newborns. When all the children's graves, age 10 and younger, were identified, it was found that nearly 50% died in the first 3 months of life. Okay, maybe this was just an epidemic that hit the newborns especially hard. But when the graves of those who made it to adulthood were examined, it was seen that there were 60% females to 40% males. The reduction appears to have been in the male side of the population. So could this massive increase in infant burials at Avaris be evidence for the killing of the male Israelite children? It's an intriguing thought, but it made me sad to think of what it could have meant. The murder of thousands of innocent boys.
For generations, the Exodus story has given hope to people around the world in their quest for liberation. Inspired by the freeing of the slaves from the most powerful nation on earth. But were the hopes and dreams of all those people merely based on a myth?
Who would invent a story about our ancestors were slaves? I bet I can see people saying, our ancestors were princes, our ancestors were great merchants, our ancestors were, something wonderful and glorious and noble, but we were slaves. Why? I mean, if you're going to dream up a story, surely you'd come up with a better one than that.
And if none of it happened, how do you explain an Egyptian papyrus with a list of slave names that seem to come right out of the pages of the Bible?
There's one particular document which is quite amazing. It's called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And this actually is a list of domestic servants from one estate. We have maybe up to 100 people listed as slaves in Egypt. When we look at those names, 70% of them are Semitic names. And you can literally pick up Israelite names in there. Menachem, Issachar, and Asher, the names of 2 of the tribes of Israel. Shiphrah, one of the Hebrew midwives in the Exodus story, a name that appears in this document. These are Hebrew Israelite slaves, and they're in a papyrus from the 13th dynasty, not from the 19th dynasty, not from the time of Ramesses II in the New Kingdom, but from the 13th dynasty, the Middle Kingdom.
What does this mean to you? What does it say?
This is real evidence for the time when the Israelites were in Egypt as slaves. It's when you get a text, suddenly you've got history. Archaeology, you have to interpret. When you have a text, this is something very different.
This slave list is predominantly female, which matches the grave evidence from Avaris.
The fact that they continue to multiply, despite the oppression, despite the slavery, despite the boys being killed, it just shows that there was a divine plan here at work, and that this whole event was miraculous.
The thing I'm puzzled by is why so many Egyptologists ignore the Brooklyn Papyrus.
Although everybody recognizes that this list is a list of Semitic slaves, and everybody recognizes that the names appearing in here are also Israelite names, these can't be the Israelites, because it's the wrong time period. The Israelites are much later in history, so these people we're seeing here in this Brooklyn Papyrus cannot be the Israelites.
So that's why they disregarded it.
So they put it to one side and say it's another coincidence.
So there appears to be strong evidence matching the multiplication and slavery steps of the biblical sequence. Indication of a rapid expansion of the Semitic population at Avaris. The only time in Egyptian history that there's evidence of Semites dominating the delta like this. These Semites begin free, powerful, and prosperous, but then succumb to impoverishment and malnutrition. There is a sharp rise in the number of infant burials. Near the end of this period comes a list of slaves, many with Hebrew names. And all this occurring 400 years earlier than would be expected with the Ramesses Exodus.
But what if all these finds in the Middle Kingdom are not a coincidence, and the Exodus actually did happen much earlier than the reign of Ramesses? To see if that's the case, I would need to look more closely at the details of the biblical story concerning the next step of the sequence, the judgment of Egypt and the Israelites' deliverance from bondage.
The Bible records that Moses fled to the land of Midian. After 40 years of living as a shepherd, Moses first encountered God.
Moses sees a bush from the distance, and it's on fire, but it's not being consumed. So curious, he approaches to see what's going on, and God says, "Don't come any closer. Remove your shoes, for this place is a holy place." God said, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I have also heard their cry. Like a shepherd rescuing his sheep, God commands Moses to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, 'Let my people go so that they may serve me.'" Moses comes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh does not listen, refuses to let the people go, and God sends the first of a series of spectacular plagues against the land of Egypt.
In Exodus chapter 5, the God of Israel says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says, "Who is Lord? Who is Jehovah? Who is Yahweh that I should listen to him?" And so we have setting up there this context. Who really is the God to be obeyed? Who is the one in control of things? And in the Egyptian view of things, Pharaoh was the god of the Egyptian state. He was responsible for cosmic order. He was responsible for the proper flow of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the fertility of the fields, and so on. And now we have the God of Israel, the God of creation of the Bible, who's saying, "No, wait a minute. That's not what you do. I'm the one who controls all these things." So he begins with the Nile and ends in the ninth plague with the sun. And these two things that Pharaoh is said to control are completely outside of his control.
God protected the children of Israel from these plagues, while the rest of the land was being devastated by them, to where Pharaoh's servants themselves pleaded with him, saying that this was the finger of God and that Egypt was being ruined. But Pharaoh would not relent. He knew that Egypt depended on the work of these foreign slaves.
In Israel, Mahoney also had the privilege to speak with the Prime Minister. Although seen by most as a political figure, Benjamin Netanyahu was also an author and historian, like his father.
Tell me about the effect the Exodus has had upon civilizations in the last 3,000 years.
Moses was the greatest revolutionary of all time. Remember that in antiquity there were grand empires that were based on one principle, that is slavery. And Moses challenged that twice. He challenged it by taking his people who were slaves and bondage in Egypt and freed them, took them to their promised land. But he also challenged it by providing a code, a moral code for mankind that said that it is not the king or the emperor that decides the law. There's a higher law. And these were absolutely revolutionary ideas.
text then says that God sent the 10th and final plague to force Pharaoh's hand. The death of the firstborn of man and beast. The Lord told the Israelites that each household was to slaughter a lamb and mark the doorpost with the blood of the lamb. And on that glorious night, death passed over all the homes marked with blood. But in every home that wasn't marked, all the firstborn males died. There was crying and wailing in every Egyptian home because each family had lost someone.
The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, affected everybody. Even Pharaoh's firstborn died that night, and the will of the people, the Egyptians, was completely shattered. The 10th plague broke Pharaoh's defiance of God, and he finally let Moses and the people go. But then Pharaoh changes his mind, pursues the Israelites with his army, and at the sea, God parts the water so that the Israelites can escape while it destroys the entire Egyptian army.
Every year, Jewish families from around the world celebrate the deliverance of Israel from Egypt during the Passover feast. Records confirm.
If the judgment happened as described in the Bible, Egyptian society would have collapsed.
This guy right here is crazy.
Written by a scribe named Ippur, the papyrus known as the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage poetically describes a series of calamities and the chaos that followed.
Ippur. We don't know who it was, but he was obviously somebody in the position to address His Majesty, the King. There's only one copy of this specific text, and that is here in the Leiden Museum. It's a very, very vivid report, or would-be report, of what happens to Egypt when a central power falls away.
Many believe a collapse of Egypt's power is exactly what would have happened due to the plagues of Exodus. And as I compared the book of Exodus to the writings of Ippur, I too was intrigued by the similarities.
To convince Pharaoh, God says, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. And as it hits the ground, it will turn into blood.
Behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water, and he who poured water on the ground seizes the mighty in misery.
That voice is the writings of Ippur.
And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish of the Nile died, and the Nile reeked, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile.
The river is blood. If you drink of it, you lose your humanity and thirst for water.
All the livestock of the Egyptians died. Fire rained down from heaven, and the Lord sent hail on the land. Even the flax and the barley were smitten.
Gone is the barley of abundance. Food supplies are running short. The nobles hunger and suffer. Those who had shelter are in the dark of the storm.
I see no connection between the papyrus of Ipuwer and the story of the plagues of Egypt. It is in a way, but in a very indirect way, an eyewitness report of a historical period. It pretends to be such a report, but in fact it isn't.
At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt.
I'm gonna have to stop, but there's a lot more. This is only half of it. Ipuwer, that's some of the most fantastic stuff. He's describing in detail from an Egyptian viewpoint what happened, what he was seeing, and this poor man, this poor man, educated beyond good sense, is saying he seems to be writing a historical account, but he's not. It's an imagination. He'll go on and say that. He'll talk about how he's imagining it, and it's like, how do you know it's imagining? You're imagining that he's imagining. Anyways, so the only reason I showed you that, if we were going through the whole Exodus book or something, we might watch the whole thing, but it was really good to be able to show you the land of Goshen, since that's what we talked about. I'm going to step back for anybody that watches this later. Before we take our prayer request, last week I asked you what book you wanted to start next week, and this was what you reported back. So as I told you, I prayed about it this week, and Saturday I was actually reading through Proverbs in my own reading schedule, and I was just asking the Lord, so I've already imagined what this might look like, but give me a feel for this. How's this going to work, you know? And I want to give you for instance, of what it would be like, and then I'm going to show you what I feel like He put right in my heart and mind as an option, so that we will still go through Proverbs. But I happened to open it up to Proverbs 20 when I was talking to Frank earlier in the week about this. But this is what class would kind of be like. So Proverbs 20 verse 1, at least portions of it. Wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise. Right? So that's verse 1. Well, we might begin to talk about that. The dangers of drinking and how it can do harm, right? And especially if you're intoxicated. The next verse says, the terror of a king is like the growling of a lion. He who provokes him to anger forfeits his own life. So then we shift gears, and our discussion is going to go to maybe respecting leaders and governing authorities and things like that. And the verse 3 is, keep away from strife. Keeping away from strife is an honor for a man, but any fool will quarrel. So that subject would be on, not fighting, being patient. So basically, almost with every verse, the majority of it, there are sections where you get 6-8 verses, even a chapter sometimes, that is talking in the same theme. But there'll be other places where we're really hopping in very drastic areas as we read through one chapter. Here's what came to my mind as an option. Because Proverbs is a wonderful, wonderful book to study, and I don't want to not study it because it's going to feel choppy compared to doing something that's more of a narrative type of book. So I was thinking, what if we took the first 15 minutes every week of class and we just start going through the book of Proverbs. We will go as far as we go in the first 15 minutes. If that's 3 verses, if it's 10 verses, if it's a whole chapter that we get through in 15 minutes. But we will be studying the Proverbs together, but we won't take the full hour bouncing around. And then we can take the last 45 and we can go into, if it's Romans or Hebrews or James or whatever book that we want to study. So we're kind of splitting the baby, speaking of Proverbs and Solomon, giving part of our class the Proverbs experience, which is really a good experience, but also being able to teach through a book that will be a little easier to like cover more scriptures. If we just do Proverbs, if you all say no, just we'll grind through Proverbs, we will. It'll take us longer, or we will read them and we will say, does everybody get that? And then we'll go to the next one, and it just can feel kind of odd. There'll be some Proverbs, as we do it anyways, that will be very interesting and maybe a lot of discussion, and there'll be others we'll read it and everybody will go, well, that's pretty simple. Okay, we'll go to the next one and we'll just cover it as we go through it. I'm not at all suggesting that we don't do Proverbs, because I love it. I read them a lot, and I look forward to doing it with us as a class. But this is a way to kind of break up Proverbs with another type. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting the best of both worlds?
Yep.
All right. So next week, we will start in Proverbs 1, verse 1 for the first 15 minutes. And I know by the numbers, if we take out Cammie, who voted here, and here,
And Debbie.
then we only had one person vote for Hebrews, 6 for Proverbs, 4 for Romans, and 2 for James, and then Cammie can pick whichever one she wants out of it.
The only reason why I voted for everything is because I wasn't voting for a particular book, but more for a certain universal subjects, such as colors, or tassels, or bronze versus iron, which doesn't make sense to me yet.
All right. Yes, sir, Ken?
Well, I wasn't here to vote.
Yes.
Can I throw one in?
Throw one in.
James.
James.
Me too.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I wasn't here either. I was communicating as well.
Okay.
It seems like the one book I've never read.
How about we do James? We did Romans about 2.5 years ago. So Romans would be a repeat part of our class. It would not be a repeat for the others, but we'll come back around and catch Romans. Hebrews, I'm going to love to study one day, and we'll get to it at some other point. But I love the book of Hebrews too. But James, the positive thing, James is only 5 chapters. And if you don't already know this, James is known as the Proverbs of the New Testament, because it's a small book of short, wise statements. Yeah. So what we really need is doing Proverbs with James, and we'll see the wisdom and how some of it even you'll see where James got it from. Yeah.
So
And
that Roman Empire's dead anyway, so.
All right, I'm going to shut off the camera. You know what it looks like in that camera view right there? Looks like I'm standing on a hillside in Egypt.
It's a